So one of the exciting things going on in our family the last few weeks is that my parents have decided to finally downsize now that both of their kids are out of the house. And they had to move close to one of them. And they didn't choose me. They bought a house close to my sister, and as they're getting ready for the move, of course, they're cleaning out the house that I grew up in for 29 years. They lived in that house, and they've got all these things, and so they come by randomly one day with a truckload of things, my things. My favorite part was the love seat that I put directly in front of my TV, and both seats in the love seat recline, and I feel like I've just got it made now. They brought me knickknacks. My dad, for some reason, kept newspapers of when the Braves won the World Series in '95, and now I have them. They brought me puzzles that I played with as a kid, which I just had to do right away. Macon was interested for about 30 seconds, but I finished those puzzles. But perhaps one of my favorite things happened this week is we had this, it's a puzzle, it's a nice wood puzzle of all the states in the United States. Each state is a different piece. And underneath it tells you the capitals and all this or that. Yes, I was always a nerd. But this is one of my favorite puzzles. And Macon wasn't all that interested in it, but we played with it this week. And sure enough, a little bit later in the week, we lost Rhode Island. On a map like that, you know how big Rhode Island is? Like the size of your fingernail, okay? And it's in the playroom, it's strewn about, I don't know where it could possibly be, and I'm frustrated, and Jen and I are both feeling guilty because, we had that puzzle at my parents' house for 29 years, never lost a piece, it didn't make it a week in our house. So we're rummaging around, and Jen is usually the person who finds things, as I imagine most mothers in the house are. And she usually is the one who comes up with it, but she couldn't find it, and she was getting frustrated. I said, okay, well, I'll help. And you know what? I rummaged around, and I looked under his little play kitchen, and there's this little thing down there, and I grabbed it, and I found Rhode Island. And Jen was so happy, it was like brownie points the rest of the week. It was amazing. Which is a silly story, but one of my favorite things from the week. So anyway, we have all 50 states. We don't have to change the flag, just so you know. Last week, we started a series we're calling The Heroes of Faith, and we said that faith is so foundational in the Bible, so foundational for the Christian life, that it really is something we should understand and talk about more and figure out what it means to have faith. We talked about how Hebrews 11 contains this list of all these heroes of faith who lived it out and modeled it incredibly well. And as such, today we are beginning to go through these different heroes. And our first one, and I think is the one that has to be the first, is a guy by the name of Abraham. Abraham is perhaps the premier model and example of faith itself. Paul references Abraham over and over again in his argument about how faith is our way of accepting and reaching out and finding the grace of God. The phrase that Paul focuses on is where it says Abraham believed God and it was credited to him as righteousness. And it forms a key argument in Paul's explanation of the role of faith in salvation. By faith, we are said to become children of Abraham because he is the father of all those who live by faith. Abraham's legacy pervades our world. All three of the major monotheistic religions, from Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, all trace their beginnings to this man. Outside of Jesus, his influence in the world can hardly be rivaled. If anyone had an impact, if anyone created a legacy, Abraham is that guy. And if you read Paul and you read James and you read others, it sounds like the reason Abraham had that legacy was because he was the father and premier model of faith. Abraham. So number one on our list of the heroes of faith has to be this man. Abraham. And if you know the Bible a little bit, you may know some of it. If you don't, I'm going to try to catch you up. But God chose Abraham to begin what is really the largest narrative in all of Scripture. When God has lost people in the garden, he can't have the relationship with humanity that he wanted because of sin. God forms this rescue plan, and he begins with one person, a guy by the name of Abraham. And through that person, he builds up this incredible story. Through Abraham, God builds up a nation. It's the nation we call Israel. Through that nation, he teaches to the world the law via Moses. Through the law, he reveals the lostness of humanity via the prophets. And through the lostness of people arises the need for a Messiah. And it is through all of that, beginning with Abraham, the entire line down, in which is born Jesus Christ, to be that Savior, to rescue us from the lostness of humanity. This profound story essentially begins on the foundation of Abraham. This is the movement God started in chasing humanity in order to retrieve them and forgive them of their sins. And it all begins with Abraham. It's an unbelievable story. And God's choosing of Abraham, or actually his name originally was Abram, is seemingly random. We get no justification, no reason why he deserved to be the foundation of all of this. It's as if God just looked down at the earth, chose a man, and said, "This is the man from whom I will build a nation." The record of this is actually Genesis chapter 12, beginning in verse 1, if you want to follow along. This is how his entire story begins. The Lord had said to Abram, "Go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land that I will show you." Just go. And he gives him this promise: "I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse. And all peoples on earth will be" what? "Blessed through you." There's this promise that, hey, I know it doesn't seem like you're in a position to do a whole lot, Abram, but I'm going to turn you into a great nation, and you will bless all nations, believe it or not. And the only thing he has to do with that information is go. And I think the seemingly random nature of this promise given to Abraham is interesting, because it reminds me of salvation in so many ways. Faith begins with believing a promise for a blessing that you cannot and do not deserve from someone you cannot see. Faith means that you believe that there is something greater for you, given to you, even though you don't deserve it, by someone you cannot see. Salvation does not depend on anything we do, but it is by faith that we trust someone else's promise. And so it is by faith that we become the children of Abraham, who believed a promise. And there's no justification for it. God didn't say, well, you're a particularly good person, so I'm going to pick you out, and you're going to be part of this salvation journey. No. It is those of us who respond to the offer, deserving or undeserving, that find ourselves living in God's plan. And that's an unbelievable thing. Faith in a grand promise we don't deserve. Salvation does not depend on any virtue we possess or any work we do on our own. You have to entirely trust something in someone you cannot see. And the reaction to that is very simple. Go, and I'll show you what to do next. God doesn't lay the plan out for us from the beginning. He says, believe my promise and go. And that's incredibly intimidating. But hopefully, through Abraham's life, we can get a little bit of a gist of how we can live in that. Now, to really understand who Abraham is, you kind of got to get a little bit deeper. And you need to understand his name. In the Old Testament, we find that names often have significant meaning. Abram is his original name. Eventually, God changes it to Abraham. Abram means great father. It means great father, someone who is a really magnanimous and great dad. And then Abraham means father of a multitude, like a father many, many, many times over. And so Abraham, his entire identity is wrapped up in what? Being a father. And if you know enough about the story, you know that it's kind of ironic. Why? Because he has no kids. Have you ever had a destiny or something you thought was who you were, your identity, and it just didn't turn out the way you thought? This is what's going on with Abraham. He's supposed to be this great father, this father of a multitude. He has no kids, and yet he's been given this profound promise by God. In fact, you can see his anxiety about it, right? Because if you jump over to chapter 15, notice we're only like 3 chapters into his story. By 15, you can see him getting anxious and lifting this anxiety up to God. I don't know if you can relate to this, but Abram, seeing this problem, he says it like this, chapter 15, verse 2. But Abram said, "Sovereign Lord, what can you give me since I remain childless? I'm supposed to be the great father. And the one who will inherit my estate is Eliezer of Damascus," apparently a servant. And Abram said, "You have given me no children, so a servant in my household will be my heir." This is disappointing to a man whose entire identity and name is wrapped up in being a father. Then the word of the Lord came to him and said, "This man will not be your heir, but a son who is your own flesh and blood will be your heir." He took him outside and said, "Look up at the sky and count the stars, if indeed you can count them." Then he said, "So shall your offspring be." Look up at the night sky, count the stars, and if you ever get to the end, that's how many kids you're going to have. Maybe not literally his direct children, but his ancestors, the way that he will bless the world. And then there's that famous verse in verse 6 that Paul references so often. Abram believed the Lord, and he credited it to him as righteousness. God recognizes his frustration and reassures him with this promise, with a grand image of looking at the night sky and saying, "This, you will have more than this." So here's my question, right? Here's my question. If Abram's identity is wrapped up in being a father, but he has no kids, if he had one plan in life, and then it doesn't go the way that he thought, and in fact, he's believing this promise of God, but he's not seeing the results, what is your destiny? What is your plan in life? What would frustrate you if it never came to pass? What did you grow up believing that you would always be, that would always be the case for you? What is your destiny? My name is Tyler, which means someone who lays tiles. And I have to admit, I didn't grow up really thinking that that was my destiny. I never bought into that plan. Sorry, I have a weird sense of humor. But I will tell you what was part of my plan that didn't go the way I thought. For me, as with I think a lot of people, I felt like my life should grow into the plan that you always see, living a normal American life. In particular, for me, marriage. My parents have been married 47 years. Both sets of my grandparents were married more than 50 years. My parents, in order to be married 47 years, they were approximately 8 and 9 when they got married. So they tell me. I went to a Bible college, which, by the way, they're also known as marriage factories. Because everyone who comes out of Bible college is somehow engaged or married at the end. And I went through 5 years with not so much as a real girlfriend. Then I went to seminary and the same thing happened. And then I got to working in the world and the same thing was still the case. I was approaching 30 and it was still the same thing. My dad had been married more than 10 years by the time I even met my wife. And I was frustrated. I always thought life was going to go this particular way. It was part of my destiny. And when it didn't go the way I thought, or in the timing that I wanted it to go, there was a lot of despair and a lot of heartbreak and a lot of struggle through that season of life. And I'm guessing perhaps that you have something similar in your life, something that didn't turn out exactly the way that you thought it was going to turn out. That you believed God at some point, but then when things didn't go the way you thought, you got frustrated in the process. It might be getting married didn't happen as quickly or ever for you in the way you thought. It might be having or not having kids. It might be living with a spouse into old age only to wind up divorced or widowed or something of that nature. It might be that you lost a child when you imagined a perfect family. It might be that you moved away from your hometown when you always thought you would stay here forever. It might be that you wanted to get a job that would actually fit into what you studied in school or what your passions were, and it turned out that none of those things ever really panned out. We all have plans, and sometimes those plans don't work out, and our life doesn't look exactly like we thought it was going to look. And the problem as it relates to faith is that faith gets complicated when our plans don't seem to line up with God's. Abram's entire identity is wrapped up in being this father, and he's got this promise from God that he's going to be a blessing to all nations, that he'll have ancestors as many as the stars in the sky. His entire identity, his purpose, his role, and everything he imagined about life is wrapped up in that. But there's this one aching, egging on problem of not having a kid. And it's frustrating. And faith gets complicated when our plans don't line up with God's. And so Abraham's biggest problem, his biggest test of faith, is would he ultimately trust God's plan or rather pursue his own? And if you know some of the rest of Abraham's story, you might know that he failed that test. The father of all faith couldn't quite wait on God's plan to happen. Flipping over, by the way, we're in chapter 16. We are literally one chapter since God made that grand promise about the stars in the sky. That's how long his faith lasted, a chapter. Then we get into chapter 16, and we get verses 1 and 2. And we find out about his wife, Sarai, later Sarah. Now, Sarai, Abram's wife, had borne him no children, but she had an Egyptian slave named Hagar. And so she said to Abram, "The Lord has kept me from having children. Go sleep with my slave. Perhaps I can build a family through her." And shockingly, Abram agreed to what Sarai said. Abram, I love how, Sarai has this grand idea, and Abram's like, "Oh yeah, okay, sure, why not?" One chapter after believing this grand promise of God, that he would have these children as numerous as the stars in the sky, and being credited to him as righteousness, one chapter later, he's rushing God's plan and moving into something that is unwise. It is a terrible idea from beginning to end. It leads to a lot of heartache. It leads to jealousy. It leads to people being sent away. And honestly, there's a certain amount of injustice on the part of Hagar and her son Ishmael, because they're not treated well when it all comes to pass. Abraham tried to rush God's plan, and instead of trusting it, he ran out to do his own thing, and lo and behold, it went badly. And here's my question for you. Has it ever been in your case that you rushed God's plan, that you saw something in your life that just had to be, that you had to be like other people, you had to have your life work out in the American dream, it had to be all the ways you'd always imagined it, and so you rushed into a bad decision? Has that ever happened to you? Do you know anyone that's happened to? As a minister, I see people blow through red flags in dating all the time because they so desperately want in their plan to be married. They blow through the red flags, and then what ultimately happens? A lot of heartbreak, a lot of hurt, a lot of difficulty. I see people quit jobs without having better options because it didn't fit into what they thought the plan in their life was. I see people take shortcuts to making money or go into debt in order to live at the level they think they were always deserved to do so. Even people of faith who have a great belief in God's promises make these errors all the time. And yes, they can continue to be used by God. God uses people who are all sorts of broken, including Abraham. And if you think that was the only mistake he made, go back and read the rest of the story. I mean, this is the guy who basically lied about his wife twice in order to save his own skin. Abraham, the father of all faith, made mistake after mistake after mistake. And perhaps most importantly, rushed God's plan to fulfill the identity he thought he had. One of our errors in society is chasing after that dream and making bad decisions in the process because we think that getting that dream makes up our identity and who we are, what makes us valuable. And the moment we learn to give that up and trust that God makes us valuable, whether those things work out or not, is the moment we start to get self-esteem from things that can't be taken away from us, which allows us to have the freedom to take the feelings away and make better decisions. One of the problems in our world is rushing into nonsense because we don't know where our identity really comes from. I see it all the time, and it's a frustrating thing. Never ever is it better to rush into our own plans without waiting on God's. God's plan is always infinitely better. And we see that play out in Abraham's life in, honestly, kind of fun and funny ways. You see, later on in the story, and Abraham's story is long, 3 visitors come to him, and apparently they're angels because they have a message for him. He doesn't know this right away, so he's just treating them with basic hospitality. He's trying to fix them food and do all these right things. And then there's this really fun part of the story. This is chapter 18, verse 9, if you want to follow along. It goes like this. The visitors are speaking, talking to Abraham. They say, "Where is your wife Sarah?" they asked him. "There in the tent," he said. Then one of them said, and here comes this renewed promise, "I will surely return to you about this time next year, and Sarah, your wife, will have a son." Well, that's surprising. They're older in years. They weren't really expecting this. I mean, God had given them their promise, but wow. Now Sarah was listening at the entrance to the tent, which was behind him. Abraham and Sarah were already very old, and Sarah was past the age of childbearing. And so Sarah, she did what? She laughed to herself as she thought, "After I am worn out and my Lord husband." That's not biblical. "And my Lord is old, will I now have this pleasure?" Then the Lord said to Abraham, "Why did Sarah laugh and say, 'Will I really have a child now that I am old? Is there anything too hard for the Lord?' I will return to you at the appointed time next year, and Sarah will have a son." This is a guarantee. This is a promise. You can count on it. Verse 15, Sarah, I love this, was afraid and so she lied and said, "I did not laugh." But he said, "Yes, you did laugh." Sarah realizes that was a ridiculous idea, that she is well past childbearing age. By some estimates, she's like 80-something years old at this point. And she's being told she's going to have a child, and it's kind of laughable. It's kind of silly. It's kind of strange. And she's sort of laughing at what is actually the goodness of God in fulfilling His promise. But it seems so unbelievable, unlikely, beyond expectation that she laughs. And what's funny is later she does have this child, and they name him Isaac, which in the Hebrew, do you know what that means? Laughter. I mean, talk about really, digging it in. I did not laugh. Yes, you did. We're naming your child Laughter. And what occurs to me is that the grand joy of God, when His plan ultimately happens, is so much better than our plan, which leads to heartbreak. Abraham has this identity. He thinks this is what he has to be. And so he pursues that plan against God's will and ultimately finds himself in heartbreak. And then finally, long term, God's plan comes down and it ends in laughter. And God's plan is so much better when we can wait, when we can be patient, when we can define ourselves by His promise and not the things that we thought we deserved or expected or wanted in life. Faith means trusting that God's plan is better, more glorious, more full of laughter, more lighthearted. Trusting God's plan instead of venturing on our own is so difficult, because we forget the value of God's promises ultimately outweigh everything else. Faith means trusting that God's plan is better, which is why ultimately Abraham becomes the father of those who have faith. Now, I told you that Abraham failed one test. He went and got his slave and tried to start a family early. But you may have heard part of this story, or you may not know the context of it, but you do know that in the end, Abraham did pass a test. What happens is that God ultimately does the most surprising thing, one of the most surprising things in all of Scripture, is He tells Abraham to sacrifice this special child, this son of promise, this guy who's his entire identity named Isaac, his son as a kid. And there's this dramatic scene where they're walking to a mountainside, and Isaac looks at Abraham, and he's like, all the wood is here, but where's the sacrifice? And Abraham's like, well, God will provide one. And it's not that God ever really wanted him to sacrifice his son. It's that God wanted to know that ultimately his identity was in God's promise and not in any other particular thing. He had to be willing to lose that thing that he so depended on in order to receive back greater the blessing of God. And so it's a test, it's a ruse, it's something God wants to prove in Abraham, whether he has learned the lesson of real faith. And going back to our initial passage last week in Hebrews 11, this is the way that writer in Hebrews 11 describes the moment. It says, Hebrews chapter 11, verse 17. He says it like this. It says, by faith, that's our key word, by faith, Abraham, when God tested him, offered Isaac as a sacrifice. He who had embraced the promises was about to sacrifice his one and only son, even though God had said to him, it is through Isaac that your offspring will be reckoned. Abraham reasoned that God could even raise the dead, and so, in a manner of speaking, he did receive Isaac back from the dead. Just FYI, if you don't know the story, right as the moment the knife is about to come down, the angel speaks up and says, stop! Don't make this sacrifice. Now I know your faith is real. It is in this story that we realize that God wanted to hint for us, thousands of years later, about a father who really would sacrifice his one and only son, only to have him raised to life as the first fruits of many more children of faith. The story of Abraham's near sacrifice of Isaac points forward to the true sacrifice of Christ on the cross. It's this moment that reminds us that God never asked for anything He didn't Himself do. It reminds us that Abraham's destiny was so much more than just to have a kid. That God had this bigger promise for him, that Abraham would be integral to God's rescue plan for humanity itself, a foundation of a nation that would ultimately birth a Messiah, that his descendants, all those children of faith, would be as numerous as the stars in the sky, and he would be a blessing not only to one nation, but to all nations. That Abraham had this God had this plan to use Abraham in a so much bigger, better, and possibly laughable way. The fact that he was so focused on just having a kid makes it seem ridiculous. God's plan was so much bigger than what he had imagined. And it's a beautiful story, as he is the model of faith. Faith that is imperfect, faith that struggled, faith that made mistakes and honestly failed some of the tests. But in the end, he comes to learn that God's plan is better. And that's what we have to learn. That even when we think our identity and the things that we think our life should go this way, that God's plan is ultimately better. And to accept that and live in that. and allow God to do what He does, which is unbelievably good, big, bold, and might just create some laughter. A couple application steps. Here are a few things I'd say. The first two are about prayer, and I think this is important. I want you to pray this week over any frustration that you have about how your life has turned out. Many of you are probably, I'm guessing, in a place where your life didn't go exactly as you thought it would. Maybe it's a marriage, maybe it's kids, maybe it's family, maybe it's a death of someone and that you thought was always going to be there, but for whatever reason, life just isn't the way you thought it was going to be. Pray over that frustration. And know that God ultimately has a plan, can work you through it. This is not your home, and there are better things for you. Number two, pray over your anxiety that you have about how your life will turn out. This is something that I know I struggled with, but to give up that worry about, well, am I going to go to the right college, and am I going to get the right degree? Am I going to marry the right person and settle in the right place and take the right job? And all this anxiety. A lot of young folks especially have this worry that they can't figure out God's will because God hasn't told them which college to go to or which major to choose or who to marry. And they get all stressed out over trying to find God's plan. And here would be my reaction to that. You see, really in life, what you're going to find out is that God's path has a certain variety to it, and you will stumble into it in some way or another. The hard part is not finding God's path, but staying in it. Abraham was on God's path, but he got anxious and he jumped ship and he went astray somewhere else. And if he had just stayed in God's path, he'd have been okay. And we get so anxious to find God's path that we go running after it when we're already there. Because God can use you right where you are. And He can take you to where He wants you to be, right where you are. And the hard part is not finding His path, it's staying in it. Not jumping ship and not doing something, excuse me, I wouldn't say this in front of my son, but stupid. Don't jump ship. It's not about trying to find God's path, but trying to stay in it. And make sure that your identity is wrapped up in Him and only Him, so that you're not led astray to foolishness and bad decisions. Staying in God's path is honestly harder than finding it. And number three, especially if you're surprised by the way your life turned out or concerned about the way it will turn out, talk to someone who's already gone through some of their life and ask them how God led them to where they are. Someone you respect and admire, and you go, did you always plan it to be this way? And I can tell you, if you go find someone and you ask them that question, you know what you'll hear 99% of the time? No, I had no clue. I stumbled along in life, I made the best decisions I could, and God found me this thing that I never really imagined, but I'm so happy to be here. And hearing those stories from the people you admire and the people you respect will reassure you that God can use you right where you are, that life doesn't have to go according to plan, and that you ultimately can stand in God's will and be used by Him for bigger things, no matter where you are right now. And that reassurance makes a world of difference to people like me who spent their 20s so worried about everything. Relax. You are and can be in God's will. Just know that His plan is better than yours. And by the model of the Father of faith, have faith in that plan. Wait for it. Let it come to pass. And you'll be so glad you did, rather than jumping ship and making bad decisions to try to jumpstart what you think should happen. Abraham is the father and model of faith. He has to be our first hero of the faith. And if you know that you have this plan in life and you wonder why you haven't gotten there yet, I urge patience. I urge that you remind yourself that His plan is better, that you pray over your frustrations and pray over your anxiety and talk to those who have been through it before, and they will tell you that there is peace on the other side of this, because God uses you wherever you are, and you are and can be in His will. If you will, let me bow my head and pray. God in heaven, I thank you for teaching us through these really old and ancient stories things that are seemingly applicable and are applicable to this very day. The people of faith who say they believe in a God they can't see, who promises things that they can't know will happen, actually trusts us, begs of us to simply trust Him, wants us to simply wait for His timing and His purpose to become clear. That in someone who was clearly a doubter and someone who struggled with faith, He brought about the foundation of His rescue mission to the world. And therefore, all of us who say we believe become His children and ultimately yours. We are called to live by profound faith. And God, I pray that you'll help us to relax, know that your way is better, and trust you to take us there. Calm our anxiety, soothe our frustration, and let us submit to who you are and what you've called us to do. Because we are not identified by all those things we thought we wanted, but ultimately by what we do with all those things you give. I thank you for your incredible love and for your Son. And it's in His name we pray. Amen.